And I'm mindful of, the old saying that, one person's precious commodity is another person's nuisance sometimes. And there's legislation pending now in the Congress that would address certain aspects of the board's longstanding preemption policy that's recognized in law. Without getting into any pending cases by any means, it's not my intent, but do you have any suggestions or any views or concerns about changes that might come about in the area of preemption of local and state regulation and oversight over short line operations, and what it might mean if we start with one commodity and then look at other commodities later that someone else might view as a nuisance?
Well, the preemption issue has got enormous potential to do bad things to the small railroad industry. It engenders a sense of uncertainty and a lack of predictability about the future, and therefore has got an immediate impact on whether people should invest, whether shippers should get involved with the short line railroad. And since the short line railroads do not have the reservoirs of capital resources that the Class 1s do, any kind of litigation that the small railroads are engaged in is extremely damaging. And so for a Class 1 railroad, they might be able to muscle their way through with a particular legal challenge on one thing or another. From a small railroad standpoint, any kind of costs like that would be unacceptable and basically would put them out of business. So the preemption issues on a whole scale of subjects are things that are very, very troublesome to the small railroad industry, and we strongly believe they should not be pursued or enacted at all.
Mr. Hefner, any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the problems with state and local regulation for short lines is its inconsistency, which of course is the reason why the federal government or federal activity preempts state and local regulation in the first place. One thing that, and again, this is not really an issue for the Iowa Pacific Railroads, but for some short lines that serve what I would call the garbage generating part of the country, the traffic is going to move. It's either going to sit and it's going to stink, or it's going to move. So why not enable it to move on the most efficient means of transportation, namely the railroad? Short lines do a great job of gathering this stuff, but when it comes to the junction, it's going to move by one of the 7 major railroads in all likelihood. So I think that the current enthusiasm maybe in state and local government, and maybe now even Congress, to rein in preemption is bad public policy. If I can one other thought occurred to me about the funding issue that I want to mention. It's very difficult for many short line railroads to get private capital. Many years ago, I attended a kind of a seminar on entrepreneurship, and I ran into a guy that I had gone to college with who, I don't know if he still is, but at one time was president of a local venture capital firm here in Washington. And I said I'd like to talk to him, and I told him about what, and he said kind of curtly, abruptly, "We don't do turnarounds," referring to short line railroads. And that was the end of that conversation. So I want to tell you how difficult it is for short lines to find not debt capital, and I guarantee you that short lines can find very pricey debt capital along the lines of what you see happening in the real estate lending industry, but finding equity capital.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Vice Chairman Buttrey for any questions. No questions. Commissioner Mulvey.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank General Simmons for his kind words about my efforts on behalf of the short line railroads when I was on the Hill. I would like to add, though, that at that time, I think the biggest contribution that I made was brokering an agreement between the short lines and the brotherhoods, and having the brotherhoods step back from opposing the program and in some cases actually work for it. And I think even today that as we look at looking to invest in the railroad industries, I think it's important that all the stakeholders, including the brotherhoods, be included and be part of this effort to improve investment in the railroad industry. Let me turn for a moment to the RIF program. In Safety Lou, there were some efforts to removing the obstacles to the RIF program. I know that there was a lot of dissent between people like myself and others who supported making greater use of it, and the OMB, which felt that the RIF program ought to be treated the same as a private bank. The question whether or not you have a private bank, why would you need a RIF program, but that regardless of that. Did any of the changes to Safety Lou actually help to get more loans out, or are we still basically running into the same kinds of problems that we had before those changes were made? And what further things do you think should be done in order to free up those monies, either both of you?
Let me just comment briefly and put your question in the context of the 9-year history of it very briefly. As you recall, and as you rightly pointed out, the number of loans approved is somewhere around $400 million for about 13 or 14 railroads, freight railroads.
Mm-hmm.
It took 4 years to get the first loan through. Now, to be fair, the FRA, the DOT, and the OMB in those early years were not structured or prepared to deal with these loans, and so applications came in a variety of forms and formats. People struggled with them, but ultimately we managed to get a system in place that now is fairly efficient. And Safety Lou did put a 90-day legal requirement to expedite those loans from receipt of an accepted application. So in theory, once everybody agrees that the application is complete and the FRA accepts it, the clock starts to run. And at the end of 90 days, you're supposed to have a decision one way or the other. And so that certainly has not happened. So despite the good intentions of that and the force of law, we have not seen much improved over the time period. We have increased the loans incrementally, but certainly not given the potential that is there and the volume of money that is there for the loan. It just has not seemed to work very well. The issue is not so much with the FRA, which I think now has a very solid system, and the process in the Department of Transportation, I think, is consistent and reliable. The problem seems to be with the Office of Management and Budget. In previous years, they recommended that administration budgets recommended that the RIF program be terminated, and the current budget now has shifted off termination to a view that it should be structured so that it helps the most needy railroads. However, that's not well defined. So while there is a little change in it, the practical results of more loans to those that could certainly put them to good work has not materialized.
Mr. Hefner?
I would agree. And I remember when this program first started, you had to have audited financial statements, and most short lines don't have audited, or many short lines don't have audited financial statements because very few short lines are publicly traded. They'll have an audited statement if their lender requires it. So I remember that was one very specific problem. The process itself is what I would call intimidating. It makes looking for any sort of college loan a cinch by comparison. Any sort of commercial loan a cinch by comparison. You have to have an environmental process, as I understand it. You have to have kind of a third-party financial analyst process similar to the third-party environmental contractor process. The FRA, understandably, is looking for some sort of collateral. If anything, my impression is over-collateralized. And when you talk about the neediest railroads that need this money seem to be the ones that have the most difficulty qualifying. So you've got to be in a good enough shape financially to get the loan, but not in too good a shape. So it's kind of a worst of both worlds.
Like the old saw, the only people who can borrow money easily are those who don't need it.
Precisely.
Well, what could the board do in this regard? Should we hold a hearing? We don't have authority in this area, although this particular hearing today is broader than issues that the board has direct authority over. But would you recommend that the board hold a hearing on this issue and have FRA and OMB and the short lines come and air out their concerns publicly?
I certainly would. I mean, the whole business of utilization of the RIF has got a broad application for the railroad industry. I mean, there's certainly sufficient funding available for Class 1, 2, and 3 railroads there. But obviously, because of the Class 1's market reach, they don't need the RIF loan to the same degree that the smaller railroads do. But we have tried any number of approaches to unhinge this problem. I've been at it for 5 years, and my predecessors were at it, and there are some in this room here that were at it from inception. And the same problem, we've made incremental moves, but we haven't solved the problem, and the logjam is still there. So I would endorse almost any approach at this stage to try to shed some light on the problem and get a fix in place.
And my comment, which I must say is a personal one rather than for my client, but I think the board's role should be that of what's the term, bully pulpit, that because neither the board nor individual members of the board really have any jurisdiction in this area, I think your role would be to speak out as individuals and to convince Congress that it needs to act.
You mentioned on investment tax credit that some of the railroads that don't make profits and therefore can't take advantage of it.
That's
Originally, the investment tax credit was supposed to be fungible. Therefore, those railroads that did make the profit could sell it to someone who could use it. In my understanding is correct, the IRS ruled against the fungibility, that it could not be sold, or am I wrong on that? What's happened with that part of it?
Well, they never were to be sold.
Allowed to be used by others.
You could, if you had a shipper on your line and he wanted to invest, he could use your tax credits to enhance the system. But as you may recall, the whole business of selling tax credits 20 years ago was a very, very hotly controversial issue and was fundamentally eliminated. And Congressman Thomas was deeply involved in all of that and was strongly opposed to any hint that selling the tax credits would be possible. The best we could get was that if you had a shipper on your line, he could participate by using your tax credits if he was investing in increasing your system or his own system that connected with you. So the real issue that we've got in the new, we had some problems with IRS rules and interpretations, and we fixed those legislatively. So that problem has gone away. The real issue, and one that we were aware of, but not in the depth that we might have been, was the alternative minimum tax. And so this run at an extension of the tax credit for another 3 years has clearly got an alternative minimum tax fix attached to it. So if we can get that done, and we can get this tax credit extended for another 3 years, I think we'll have a very, very solid tool for enhancing Class 2 and Class 3 infrastructure. The dilemma with all of this that we face, of course, is that all of these new cars that you all are so familiar with, and the backlog of cars that you can't order a car now and get it delivered until '08, whether it's an ethanol car or a gun or a box car or anything else, all of that equipment is to a standard of 286,000-pound axle weight cars, a much heavier car. That drives this infrastructure fix. And so the original underpinning of that tax credit was to get funding to get the infrastructure fix to handle the heavier cars so that you could interchange with the Class 1s. If we are not successful in getting this infrastructure upgraded, the short lines suffer mightily because the Class 1 railroads are not going to short load their cars, and they're going to be forced to stop interchanging with you. And they'll go to trucks, or your customers will go to trucks. So for us, this is an enormously important matter, getting this tax credit extended and getting this RIF loan repaired so that we can get on to upgrading the infrastructure. We know clearly that the $7 to $11 billion analysis of the roughly 50,000 miles of Class 2 and Class 3 railroads, we know that we will, at the end of the day, fund an awful lot of that, the lion's share of it. What we need to do is keep the system pumped and primed so that we're not slowing down and stopping completely while we try to drum up this money to get this thing fixed. Somewhere in the range of 25 to 30,000 miles of that infrastructure needs upgrade. Some percentage of it we'll know in about 4 or 5 months. We'll know what percentage, where we are. We do an annual or a biannual survey of the railroad industry, the small railroad industry, to figure out where we are. We'll find out a lot about the tax credit, and we'll find out a lot about the infrastructure upgrades when we complete that this summer. So we'll get a better handle on that. But clearly, our lifeblood is to get this money pumped into the system so that we can get the infrastructure up to appropriate standards to interchange with the Class 1 railroads.
Thank you. The clock is ticking on this.
Clock is ticking.
I recall when the first study was done, I think it was by Zeta Tech up in Pennsylvania, up to Philadelphia, which did the original $7 billion estimate and said that, well, maybe not that's for the entire system, but nonetheless, if it's not done in the next decade or so, and it's a decade ago it was done, we're going to be in serious straits.
Serious trouble. And you know, the Class 1s, you didn't get into it too much, but clearly when you look at these billions of dollars the Class 1 railroads are investing in their networks, much of that, and we got into the Caliente Bridge there, and you listened to that a little bit about the $150 million. Class 1 railroads have 17,625 bridges in that 50,000-mile network. Analyzing those bridges, which we're engaged in trying to do now, will reveal an enormous amount of expense associated with reinforcing those bridges, in some cases replacing those bridges entirely. So when you think of tunnel repair and you think of bridges, these dollars are staggering. And so we've got to get it done. That's the bottom line of it.
Thank you. Thank you, General Timmons.
Vice Chairman Fletcher, any questions? Well, thank you. That concludes. I will say, Mr. Timmons, I was intrigued with your suggestion about detailing Commissioner Mulvey, but we value him way too much here on the board. But maybe if things get rough around here, we'll talk. But I'm intrigued with that.
Just a few weeks, Mr. Chairman, would do it. Just a few weeks.
Thank you so much, both of you. We will call up the next panel. We have Mr. Alexander Camont from the National Railroad Passenger Corporation and Mr. Dale Zahner from the American Public Transportation Association. And just to alert folks, it's my hope that after this panel we will do a short break for 15 minutes and then get into the remainder. We do obviously have a long agenda today. I appreciate everyone's patience. And without further ado, whenever you're ready, Mr. Camont, we'll start with you.
Chairman Nottingham, Vice Chairman Buttry, Commissioner Mulvey, thank you for the opportunity to address the board today on this critical issue of rail capacity and infrastructure. I'm pleased to be here today with many of my colleagues from Amtrak's host railroads. By way of introduction, I've been with Amtrak just over 6 months, and in my short tenure here, I've traveled to the headquarters of each of the major U.S.-based freight railroads to speak with their chief executive officers. I believe in the importance of maintaining regular contact with my counterparts at the host railroads, whose tracks Amtrak trains use to travel throughout the country every day. Amtrak's success outside the Northeast Corridor is obviously closely linked to the success of the freight railroad industry, and I intend to work hard to strengthen our relationship. The main body of my remarks is divided into 2 parts: Amtrak's view of the nature and magnitude of the rail capacity problem, and Amtrak's support for public investment in rail infrastructure. However, allow me to begin with an overview of the corporation today. Amtrak operates over a large portion of the national rail network. Our trains traverse approximately 22,000 route miles in 46 states, serving over 500 stations. Amtrak employs approximately 19,000 people. In fiscal year 06, Amtrak ridership was 24.3 million passengers, up a little over 1% from fiscal year 05. Incidentally, ridership this year is up 4.7% year over year for the year-to-date figures. Fiscal year '06 ticket revenue was a little shy, $1.4 billion, up about 10.7% versus fiscal year '05. And this year, year-to-date, ticket revenue is up 10.7%. System-wide on-time performance was 68% in fiscal year '06. However, on-time performance for Amtrak trains operating primarily on our own tracks was much higher. Nationwide, Amtrak controls train dispatching on fewer than 700 route miles of track, primarily the Washington to Boston Northeast Corridor. On the Northeast Corridor, on-time performance of Amtrak's regional trains was nearly 80% during fiscal year '06 and 85% for the Acela Express. Acela on-time performance was nearly 90% during the first half of this year. Outside the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak's long-distance and short-distance corridor trains operate on host railroads tracks, and their movements are controlled by those host railroads' dispatchers. Because of this arrangement, Amtrak is uniquely positioned to observe the state of the national rail network. Unlike shippers who entrust their goods to the railroads to transport, Amtrak operates its own trains on host railroads across the country with Amtrak conductors and Amtrak engineers in the locomotive cab, witnessing firsthand the state of each railroad we travel on each day. Amtrak has been called the canary in the coal mine, meaning that because we operate trains filled with hundreds of passengers, each of whom expects to arrive on schedule, we are more sensitive to service disruptions than freight users of the rail network. When Amtrak trains experience declines in service, declines for the other users of the rail network are likely to follow. Amtrak has experienced significant service declines since 1999. Each route over which we operate has different challenges, but all of them, to a greater or lesser degree, encounter delays related to insufficient rail capacity and the need for additional infrastructure investment. On-time performance of Amtrak trains operating outside the Northeast Corridor has declined in recent years, but the drop accelerated sharply in fiscal year '04 at the same time that rail freight traffic began its current period of strong, sustained growth. So the obvious question is, what's causing that decline? Amtrak's train conductors, as they travel across the rail network, log every minute of delay experienced by their train. They also identify if the cause is the responsibility of the host railroad, Amtrak, or a third party, such as trespasser or weather-related delays. As a result, Amtrak has a comprehensive database of delay locations, durations, and causes experienced by our trains on the national rail network over the last 6 years. 3 patterns emerged from Amtrak's delay experience on the host railroads. First, the overwhelming majority, approximately 80% of the delay minutes experienced by Amtrak trains operating outside the Northeast Corridor, are caused by host railroad issues. Amtrak is typically responsible for about 15% of delay minutes, and third-party delays average about 5%. Most of the variability in delay is also associated most of the variability in the delay is also associated with the host railroads, while Amtrak and third-party delays are consistently small and stable. The third point is host railroad delay minutes are increasing dramatically, up about 50% during the 5 years from the first half of fiscal year '02 to the first half of fiscal year '07. So again, what's causing those delays? While Amtrak believes that growth in freight traffic doesn't relieve freight railroads of their Amtrak performance obligation, clearly the overall negative network effect of dramatically increased freight volume is inescapable. I think we all recognize that. The conditions our trains experience are very much like those experienced by drivers on the highway network. Traffic can move, and everything eventually gets where it is going, but trips are slower and more variable, which is a pattern experienced by our trains. The tightly constrained national rail network also inhibits freight and passenger movement in other ways. It limits growth. Given the demonstrated public demand for intercity rail service, this aspect of a capacity shortage is particularly harmful to Amtrak and to the public. Again, we're up something like 6% in corridor traffic year over year, which is remarkable considering our overall on-time performance. As I recently testified before the Subcommittee on Transportation of the House Appropriations Committee, Amtrak's vision is one of growth, particularly in those corridor services, which reflects 100 to 500-mile intercity types of movements, fundamental product excellence, as we're demonstrating with Acela, and sound overall management. Capacity problems on the host railroads are thwarting 2, if not 3, of these goals. Amtrak's growth is constrained by a national rail network that has little available capacity, and we cannot provide product excellence if our trains are consistently late. As to the third goal, it's difficult to manage a business whose product has serious flaws over which we have relatively little influence or control. Late trains take a toll not only on our customers and revenue, but also on equipment maintenance and on our employees. Late Amtrak trains also take a toll on the public perception of the freight railroad industry. Don Phillips, one of our country's premier rail industry observers, has pointed out that what the American public knows about the U.S. rail industry comes primarily from what they see through the windows of Amtrak trains. So what can we do? Everyone's interests are served by a fluid rail network where all trains move without delay. Railroads are motivated to add capacity to increase the efficiency and reduce the cost of handling current traffic, and to create room to grow their markets. However, because investments in rail capacity are expensive and long-lived, railroads typically make them only when the need is very clearly established. Service during the period until needed investments are completed is usually poor, raising the fundamental public interest question. It is clearly in the freight railroad's interest to build most of the capacity that is needed, although their ability to generate return on capital, as we've heard earlier today, is certainly a challenge. The inherent lag between capacity need and investment will always drive social and environmental costs during the period when too much freight is crowded onto too little infrastructure. At the same time, the rest of the nation's infrastructure, our highways and airports, also experience ripple effects of increasing congestion, interruptions, and delays. In the face of these problems, public policy makers can choose to help host railroads accelerate those investments to capture public benefits sooner. The freight railroads appearing before you today have thoroughly described the public benefits of increasing their ability to move more freight by rail. Amtrak agrees with these public benefits, but there is no need to stop there. Public expenditure can be leveraged further by investments that generate public benefits by improving and expanding passenger rail as well, again, particularly in those inner-city corridors, 100 to 500-mile stretches. There are many types of investment frameworks under discussion, including investment tax credits, public-private partnerships, federal-state matching programs, grant and loan programs for specific projects. I propose that each is needed for a particular purpose to address different aspects of the rail capacity problem. Investment tax credits are advantageous for funding investments in remote, non-urban areas that benefit the entire rail network but have little local constituency. As the only entity other than the host railroads themselves that operates trains throughout the national network over thousands of miles of track in urban and rural areas, Amtrak can attest that there are many crucial rail lines, junctions, and yards, such as Rocky Mount, North Carolina, or Porter, Indiana, or Elko, Nevada, whose functioning or lack of it can profoundly affect the efficiency of the national rail network, although few voters have ever heard of these locations. Federal state matching programs and public-private partnerships allow building specific capacity in local projects where Amtrak and its state partners are focused on areas of population density. These projects are likely primarily to drive expanded intercity passenger or freight rail capacity in a particular area. Under these funding mechanisms, Amtrak and its public partners, such as states, must agree with host railroads on project needs, locations, specifications, and benefits, but must also provide some, if not all, of the funding to realize benefits specific to passenger needs. Regardless of the specific funding method used, if policymakers choose to help accelerate capacity expansion on host railroads, as Amtrak believes they should, I would encourage being mindful of two key points. First and foremost, private investment should continue to be the largest source of capital in the freight rail industry. Nothing should be done to reduce the flow of private capital into the industry, such as legislated open access provisions or any other re-regulation. Secondly, when the public does invest in rail lines over which passenger trains operate, there must be identifiable and measurable benefits that are agreed to upfront by the host railroad, the funding agency, and Amtrak. These benefits could include additional slots for passenger trains, measurably sustained improved on-time performance for specific passenger trains, or increased capacity to move freight by rail along with timely passenger service. I encourage federal and state policymakers and appropriators to fund a variety of means to expand the national rail network. The public benefits are real, both for freight and for passenger transportation. For Amtrak, additional rail network capacity is critical to achieving growth and product excellence, which, if realized, can lead to long-term passenger rail growth and a real multimodal solution to this country's transportation challenge. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. And Mr. Zaner, if you could just bear with us for a moment. We're going to just break for about 2 minutes to accommodate our court reporter. She's alone today, a one-person team, and needs to stretch her legs briefly. And as soon as she's back, we'll resume. It just should be a couple minutes. And then we'll go right on to your testimony and questions, Mr. Zaner.
My point before was that I was not sure about that before, because I was after that, but that would have influenced what you were talking about. You just said that was already incorporated in the
After waiting is zero.
yeah, but or you want to have some maybe proposed phasing. Yeah.
From where? They're trying out to get that. Little train. At least it's not. Worst case. There's a whole study that nobody's ever done, of course, in terms of looking at like Chicago. I don't know. Yeah, I just got your message. No problem. Yeah. All right. Let me know. Good. Do well. Good. Yeah, but we're doing great. Doing great. Hey, yeah, I remember. Yeah, no, you know Amy, how you doing? Good. Yeah, gotcha. First of all, I don't think anybody's real. You know.
liability.
Come to order, please.
If we could regroup and proceed. Thanks for everyone's patience. Mr. Zahner, welcome. Special welcome to you, and please proceed.
Thank you. I'm Dale Zahner. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Virginia Railway Express. I've been asked to testify today on behalf of the American Public Transportation Association with regard to commuter rail. What I'd like to talk today about is commuter rail and the use of private railroad right-of-way, why commuter rail is growing, discuss the capacity issue as I see it and we see it, and the issues we're facing as an industry. Commuter rail is growing and is probably growing along with the renaissance in the freight rail. Public officials are starting to look at rail infrastructure as a way to relieve auto congestion. You have startups now in Nashville, New Mexico, Utah, growing in Seattle, growing in Los Angeles. We're growing. We want to grow in Virginia. They're growing in Florida. There's a demand for the service by passengers that want to get on the rail, and we are constrained by capacity. Why do people want it? Public officials want it because when they look at a private railroad running adjacent to a metropolitan area or through a metropolitan area, they see that as infrastructure that can be used to move people. And why do they look at it that way? They know how painful it is to build more roads or to expand roads. Taking a property to expand highways is so painful and so long-term that they look at commuter rail as a way of answering congestion. Is it the total answer? No. But in many ways, people using commuter rail relieve congestion on the highways. In the case of the Virginia Railway Express, we remove about a lane of traffic off Interstate 95 and Interstate 66 every day during the commute hours, about 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon. And I always give the example, there was an accident in one of the railroads which caused both the Norfolk Southern and the CSX railroads that we use to prevent our service one day. That day, we dumped another 8,000 cars onto those two interstates, and traffic went to a 2-hour backup. And that's the example of what we provide to metropolitan areas. What are the issues we face? We have contractual issues in terms of making agreements with railroads, but we normally can work through those. We have liability issues in the sense that a lot of the freights are wanting us to carry more and more liability. I know that's not a discussion point for this hearing, but it is an issue and we're trying to work through that. We have costs in terms of lease costs and right-of-way fees that we pay, and I think, generally speaking, those are reasonable. But the railroad is at capacity, and I can speak in terms of Virginia. There is no reserve capacity on the CSX line currently today. What does that mean? Everything runs okay until something happens, and that can be as simple as a trespasser on the territory and the dispatcher starts to slow down the railroad because he does not want a train to hit somebody. It can be as simple as a mechanical failure on a locomotive, whether it be a freight or commuter rail, and now you're down to a one-track railroad as you work your way through the problems. These can cause delays of maybe 15, 20 minutes, but can go to 2 hours depending on the situation. There is no capacity, reserve capacity to allow the railroad to function when something goes wrong. It is just too tight. As a part of our agreement with the railroads, we've agreed to make infrastructure investments into that railroad. To date, we've made $100 million of investments in the CSX right-of-way. That includes 5 new switches, upgrading 5 switches. We just completed the Quantico Bridge, and it's in service today, went into service 10 days ago. That was a $26 million project. DRE did the civil work on that project in conjunction with CSX, who did the signal work. It was a joint project. We've also put in third track in sections of the railroad, and we continue to work to put more third track into the railroad. When it comes to investments, public investments in private railroads, it poses an issue for public officials. The biggest issue you face, and I face, is, first of all, the costs are pretty heavy. They're heavy because this is a very capital-intensive industry, The other issue is, and a lot of people have problems with this, when you make an investment in a railroad, it's usually a 40-year investment. Whether it's track or signal or equipment, generally it's 40 years of life. That's very hard to comprehend for a public official when he or she is thinking about making an investment, and what if it does not go well? You cannot get it back once it's in the ground. You're really talking about making an investment forever, in all retrospects. And that's a difficult thing. The other is trying to quantify the public benefit for an investment in a private railroad. This is very, very difficult for a public official to do this. They must see the benefit, they must feel the benefit, and know that they are doing the proper thing. And that is easier said than done. Philosophically, we can talk about it, but when you talk about investing in a $26 million bridge over the Quantico Creek that will be there for 40 years, what is the public benefit for that? Now, that project, along with a few other projects, will allow us to increase our trains from 30 a day to 40 a day. That's how we define that public benefit. But as we go on, that public benefit has to probably start to be defined in different ways, not only in terms of capacity and number of the trains we can run, but also in the quality of service. I tell people, why does somebody want to take a commuter rail? Our audience looks like the people behind me. They're about my age or a little younger. They're executives in public corporations or in the U.S. government or state government. They want to get to work on time. They have given up on the car. They've given up on the car because it's not reliable anymore. So they come across to the railroad thinking it will be more reliable. It is if it's on time. As soon as we start to degrade on-time performance, they become very angry. The people behind me know how to email, they know they're public officials, and they will speak their mind about the service. So it's a tough audience that we have, especially here in Virginia, and I think it holds true for most commuter rails. So you remember the public benefit here is it's all about the auto. These people that ride the train they're not in love with railroads. They're not in love with sitting on a rail car. They want to use their car, but they can't use it anymore. They cannot use it reliably. It puts a burden on public officials to help improve that situation. As simple as railroads look, and I'm not a railroad, everybody that's spoken before me is a railroader. In other words, their career has been in railroads, short lines, Class I railroads. My career does not come from that source. So I've been with VRE about 10 years, and I'll tell you personally, I didn't think there was a capacity issue when I started working. And let me tell you how a politician looks at it. He'll walk up to the CSX line up there and stand there, and for 30 minutes a train won't go by. Therefore, it has capacity. But I could do the same thing on Interstate 95 and stand there at midnight and say there's capacity there too. But if I stand out there at 7 in the morning, it is moving at 5 miles an hour. You go out on that railroad about the same time, between 5 and 6, a train will probably go by about every 10 to 15 minutes. It's at capacity. Can't put another train out there. As soon as one slows down, everything deteriorates, and we'll have a 15 to 20-minute delay on a VRE train. That's hard for people to understand, as simple as that sounds. But capacity is needed. We contractually have agreements with both railroads to help increase that capacity, and we're working hard at it. But let me talk about public money. We can talk about use of public money on a private railroad, but we, public, is in competition with every other mode out there. We're in competition, especially with the highways, but also subways and bus and HOV and hot lanes. A politician has to decide how that scarce resource is going to be allocated across. I've made my case with the railroads that as bad as it is here in terms of capacity right now, I've told them we're in the soup together, and I think this is an important concept, and I think they've both picked it up, Norfolk Southern and CSX. We're in the soup together. If the service does not run well, It is very, very hard for me and other and public politicians to ask for money to improve the railroad because they view the operation as poor. So what we've got to try to do is maintain the operation when you have a capacity shortage now so that we can lobby for money against the other constituents for that money and prove to them that, in fact, the railroad is a good deal and additional funding in that railroad increases capacity and, therefore, performance. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Zahner and Mr. Command. Mr. Zahner, you realize you've got two customers in front of you, too, so you don't need to just reference people sitting behind you to describe your customers. And I think I can speak for my colleague. We do know how to email and
right here.
right. Safe to say, I'm not sure if the late train will make it. That's our goal today.
I was going to ask him if he could delay the 6:50 minutes. So I could get home.
You got to complete by 7 or you're not going to take the train home.
I'm going to take the train home.
For each of you, both of you may know, I mean, I've had an interest in passenger rail for, since feels like my whole life. Grew up in, suburban northern New Jersey, where Dad walked 4 blocks to the train, and that's why we lived where we lived. And I did the same in college for summer jobs and school internships. And today I live 2 blocks from a train for the only reason because of its proximity to passenger rail to have that option. What's it like negotiating with a Class 1 railroad for additional service or improved service? Walk me through briefly that. How does it happen? Maybe, Mr. Kamau, from your perspective, let's say you have a corridor, let's just say for hypothetical reason, Richmond to Washington, or you can add to the north-south, and you want to run more train service, and or you have service problems with your existing trains. What do you do?
Well, sure. Again, particularly in today's environment, it's clearly difficult with very few slots out there and a high economic value on those slots. But it's basically service design folks that get together and say, what's possible, and we lay out the issues, and you walk through a very specific operating plan, a dispatching plan, and try to hammer out an agreement. But I will say it is possible. We in fact have just signed a new agreement with UP going forward 6 years with very specific slow order reductions earmarked and laid out over the period of the contract. So it's a complicated environment, and it really comes down to specific slot service design. And obviously, very candidly, what alternative opportunities the freight railroads do have with their very limited capacity. So it's a difficult process today.
Mr. Zahner?
I agree. Of course, we're looking for slots in the morning and the afternoon. Both CSX runs a lot of their intermodal during the day. They're trying to hold us in a window so they can use the rest of the time to run their high priority freights. So we kind of want to creep into their time. The other interesting things going on in terms of commuter rail are people's hours of work are shifting. You see a lot more 10-hour work days. It's 9 and 8, telecommuting. So people want to go to work earlier now. In Fredericksburg, they'd like a train at 4:30 in the morning, which is hard to believe, but they do. There's an audience for that, probably about 500 to 600 people. And on the other side, on Manassas line, they want a later train, 8:30 in the afternoon. So we spread. What's happening to us is we're starting to spread out or want to spread out. And I think that poses an issue for the freight railroads, again, because of the limited capacity. They'd like to keep us in a smaller window or in a window and then work us in that window and keep themselves out of there. So we're kind of running into each other out there. And the reason being, again, is there's not enough capacity.
Without digressing, I would just suggest that I don't think the work ethic of the folks on the Fredericksburg line is much different from folks on the Manassas line. But I will say it from talking to folks who use the Manassas line, they tend to report better experiences on time rates, et cetera. And so one reason you may want, you have more people on the Fredericksburg line wanting to leave at 4:30 in the morning just to make sure they can get somewhere by 7. And I've certainly spent time speaking with Commonwealth of Virginia officials about this puzzle, particularly in the Virginia area and the VRE's territory, but also vis-a-vis Amtrak. And what I get back loud and clear from the senior-most transportation officials in Virginia is, hey, when CSX fixes the heat restriction problem that's disrupting service so often in the warmer months for both VRE and Amtrak, we'll get serious about sitting down, coming to the table, and working out some type of public-private partnership. Do you hear this also, or is this just bluster?
Well, I think that's part of it. But again, as my partner here referenced, it's probably one of the most complicated, modally differentiated lines there is between D.C. and Richmond, because there's commuter, intercity, coal, and kind of higher speed express services, UPS trains, juice trains going up there. So it's very complicated to dispatch and manage. So I think simply suggesting that it's a heat order problem in the summer is probably a bit reductive.
A heat order to VRE, assuming nothing else, is a 10-minute delay to Fredericksburg. So I don't view that as critical. More critical to me are switch and signal working properly, mechanically. Let me give you. I went and saw the chief operating officers for both NS and CSX last September. We had a very, very bad summer on both railroads, and it was for a lot of reasons. There was flooding, which caused slowing down of both railroads, heavy, heavy heat for a few days, which caused us a lot of mechanical issues. Both railroads were doing tire replacement programs. And what I finally learned, and you learn some of these things by just going through them, if you have a railroad at capacity and you want to do a tire replacement program, you're going to have heavy delays. It's impossible. You're taking a track out of service. I asked CSS to do it at night, thinking, well, they're going to do it at night and they will not be in my way. Sounds pretty brilliant. Then you realize they were holding trains back, their own freights at night, releasing them in the day because the track was out of service at night. And so now we had more trains operating in the day than we normally have, and it caused delays and slowdowns. There is no free lunch out here when you're at capacity. And that's what makes this problem so serious when you're talking Amtrak, commuter rail, and heavy freight business on the same line. There is no free lunch. The only way, and I'm not a railroader, and I finally figured it out, the only way out of this is more capacity. You have to make that investment, whether it's public, private, combination of that. I think the public here is starting to realize, the public officials, that we have to put the third rail down, and we have to be a part of doing that. So back to heat orders. Heat orders in themselves do not cause that much of a problem. Talking with CSX officials, they feel that this summer will be better than last summer because they've made so much improvement in their tire replacement program that maybe they can start segmenting the railroad a little bit and reduce the amount of slow orders on that railroad as the track and the ties settle in. We'll see.
I appreciate that because obviously, as we've talked about constantly today, the operations and efficiency of the railroads will do an awful lot to meet capacity needs. And of course, I'm a big believer that the best way to get more people to take advantage of passenger rail is to show them that it actually works consistently on time. And Mr. Kamant, as you know very well, federal statute tells us that Amtrak trains get preference over freight trains. We hear anecdotally, of course, that is not always the case. What do you do when you're faced with a problem in that regard? Who do you complain to? Is there something that this agency or this board can do to help you in that regard?
Well, I think we have a fairly normal escalation process, and I think we're driving. What's most important to me is driving the relationship between our organization and the host railroads. We've gone out to UP and sat down with their dispatchers. There are always individual mistakes that happen. As you know, I used to work for UP, and I understand how hard it is to train folks in that position. You've got more experienced and less experienced dispatchers, so you'll have events that occur that are not inherently malfeasant. They're not premeditated. They happen. They're part of organizations functioning. I had people stacked up 5 deep when I walked through the door in September suggesting I should go to DOJ and start suing people. I don't consider that particularly productive, again, particularly in the highly constrained capacity environment. That may have been the case 5 or 10 years ago if there was somehow specific attitude issues, but I don't see those today. So it really is grinding it out issue by issue, getting the organizations to work together is the only way you get there. Because again, you can always point to, gee, we should have been ahead of that coal train, but then there's always another train and another train. It is, after all, there are network effects. So there's a certain sense in certain quarters that have not really lived kind of network congestion issues that, gee, if they just pulled those darn slow trains aside like they should, everything would be fine. Well, there's always another train, and there's always a stretch where there's not a siding. So the solutions are actually a lot more complicated than that. And it is grinding it out issue by issue with the front lines working together, and that's really the attitude that we're trying to drive today.
I think that's a good point. We've done that at VRE. I would say in the last year, year and a half, we have improved our relationship with both railroads. We have dispatching screens in our comm room. We see the whole railroad the way a dispatcher sees both of these railroads in our territory. We can watch them dispatch trains. Do people make mistakes? Yes. But it's like watching a chess match. You can tell some are better than others. But it's totally transparent to us. They're not trying to hide anything from us anymore. Selection of projects, improving the capacity, it requires a lot of experts, and the railroads hold the experts. Basically, FRA has been a player in here also. What projects to do? Is it worth doing? What do we get for that project in terms of capacity? FRA, CSX, Norfolk Southern are putting their best people on it. I think we're making, it's hard for me to make those determinations because I'm not a railroader. I can tell you from the projects that we have done and paid for and put them in the ground, there's been a noticeable effect. The Quantico Bridge will reduce delays on the Fredericksburg line 20 to 30%, our delays. Habitually, we've had problems with that because going from double track to single track. When we put the AF interlocking in up in Alexandria, this is about 4 or 5 years ago, we dropped delays about 30%. At the same time, though, and people don't realize this, the number of trains running through this territory now has gone up, both Amtrak, VRE, and freight. So some people look at it and say there's no improvement. I say, yes, there is an improvement. You're running more freights. You're running more of us. We started at 16 trains. We're running 30 trains a day now. We'd like to go to 40 trains. So, but I agree with Alex. At the working level is where we need the help, and we have it. When we have a major problem now, I get a personal phone call from CSX or Norfolk Southern, and they're trying to tell me ahead of time what's going on, what they think the effect will be. They're in their best judgment. It gives me time to notify passengers by email that we're going to have a problem today. You have a choice. Here's what I think the delay will be. If you want to take us, this is what I think it'll be. If you don't, you have a choice to get in your car, carpool, or do something. They're getting very, very good at that. They're getting very, very good at estimating the delays. But events now that occur on the railroad are tough. They're tough because a lot of people have to make decisions what to do, what not to do, getting the right people on the ground to alleviate the problems, whether it's a mechanical breakdown or a violation or whatever. So I feel we're moving quicker. The railroads are moving quicker, and I think we're moving quicker in the sense of communicating to the passenger. And that's all because of the cooperation.
Thanks, Presenter. Vice Chairman Buttry?
I don't have a question, really. I have a observation, and that is that, as I said earlier in the hearing today, I take the VRE just about every day, and I've ridden it all hours of the day and night. And the load factors are very good. It is, like you say, people on the VRE look pretty much like the people in this room. And since I have been on the VRE, I've had 2 delays. I think they were both identified as mechanical delays of one kind or another. They weren't that long, really. But on both occasions, the conductors came around and gave out free passes for another ride, free ride, which I think is a very nice thing to do when you have that kind of delay. So I would just commend your service, and just from my own personal experience, and I've sunk several $100,000 into the investment because your rail line is out where it is, and so it's very important to me as a commuter rail passenger, and I wish you well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Mulvey?
Thank you. Mr. Kaman, how do you define on-time performance for Amtrak trains? Is it for each station, or is it just at the end point, or How many minutes?
It's each station, and it's within 10 minutes of arrival at the station. So
But that's even more stringent a requirement, I believe, than the airline.
yes, it is, and in fact, the airlines are 15 minutes on the ground,
Right.
which is, if I may say, why we're taking share from them on the northeastern seaboard. So
Is that a problem in the sense that perhaps the definition, especially for long, and this for long distance trains as well, right?
yes, and I think there's little doubt that if we take a somewhat different look in terms of span of lateness, and perhaps if you're really looking at a very long route across the western part of the U.S., and if we report numbers that might have a couple of hour windows where the customers themselves would probably not be that upset about it once you get to the 8 or 9 hour lateness. And you do pick up in many cases, it is not quite as much as you'd think, but you pick up perhaps 10 or 15 points of on-time performance if you open up the window 30 minutes an hour, hour and a half. So we're looking at reporting that a bit differently as well.
It would strike me that a percentage of the total trip time might be a better measure as what late performance actually would be. If you are traveling, for example, from Chicago to Los Angeles, and the train is an hour late, well, of course, that trip, so an hour late might be considered to be effectively on time for that trip, albeit many of the passengers might not have begun their trip in Chicago, so it is different.
Sure, and I can also say I've certainly never gotten an angry letter from a customer that was an hour late on that sort of a trip. And
maybe the complaints should be the basis for deciding what there's an old saying, of course, that passengers complain and freight doesn't. Although it is true that shippers do complain if their freight is not on time. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, in a sense, what happens, we get complaints, but fundamentally what happens, we simply don't get business when there's very strong on-time performance degradation. I think one of our very strong pitches this year is when you look at our ridership performance, again up 6% year over year in the medium length corridors. It's a remarkable number considering that we range anywhere from 20 to 90% on time in that. So there's a tremendous demand out there. And I think, one of the questions that was asked earlier, if I may answer a question that wasn't asked, which is, the scoring of these sorts of proposals. We find ourselves in these mid-length corridors to be as much in community building as we are in transportation. There's a remarkable amount of real estate development and economic development going on around our train stations. I just came back from a trip to ride the Downeaster in Maine, and there's in excess of 80 million, almost 100 million in economic development going on because of this train. It's all of 340,000 passengers a year, but it's a great service.
There's clearly a problem with interaction between freight and passenger trains on the same rights of way. There's even a conference that occurs every year about mixing passenger and freight trains, especially high-speed trains on freight railroad rights of way. But the freight railroads have a legitimate concern that if a passenger train arrives in a slot half an hour or an hour late, you really slow down a 120-car intermodal train to accommodate a passenger train that may be a third full?
Yeah, that's in a sense the definition of the network problem. That's the compounding of the problem. So what choice do you make then as a dispatcher on a railroad? There's no philosophical answer to that. It comes down to every individual situation, because then you always ask the next question, well, what's behind him?
I'm an economist. I always like to come up with a quantification of this. I mean, I've never seen anybody sort of weight, well, what's the value of the lost time on the passenger side versus what's the value of the lost freight time on the freight train side, and how do we achieve an efficient balance between the two?
Well, I think we can certainly create an aggregate look at what the market is and what the revenue performance could be, and the societal essential implications of that. If we had across the board 90% on time performance, we could give you a pretty good shake at what the ridership would be. But I think it also begs the question in terms of cost and capital. I've heard a lot about, quote unquote, how big these numbers are, but I would ask you all, and from your point of view, big relative to what? Relative to the highway bill? I mean, we can develop a state corridor for the cost of a highway interchange, and I'm not sure that's said enough. And that's even as far as freight railroad infrastructure. I think they're small dollars compared to the dollars that pour into other modes of transportation.
They tend to be large dollars relatively, though, for the freight railroads, individual freight railroads, or for individual municipalities or state transportation budgets to accommodate these. You mentioned a $26 million bridge project, and the question, of course, is whether the CSX would say, well, that $26 million generated far, far, far more in benefits to us than its cost. And Usually, when you're looking at a project like that, you want the benefits to be some multiple of the cost, not just equal to the cost. And
But there's plenty of examples where there's little linkage. The FTA gets $9 billion from fees that have nothing to do with transit users. They're all highway funds and general tax fund revenues. So there's multiple examples. I mean, we have nearly $3 billion flowing into waterway projects, paid for by whom? Again, those examples abound.
Well, one general question for both of you. Amtrak is part of the Association of American Railroads, and of course, the APTA and the commuter railroads also operate often on freight railroad rights of way. And it does strike me that some sort of unified approach to this between the passengers with their ability to capture a large number of people and the public's response, as well as a number of representatives, plus the importance of the freight rail to our nation's economy, together on a unified front, getting money that would benefit, even sufficient money, that would be a win-win situation for both. And so that any investment would surely not only improve passenger service, but also at the same time would definitely improve freight service. But it seems to me those kinds of investments, albeit though they're large, are the ones that have the greatest likelihood of capturing political support. So that's just an observation. On the liability question, do you see any potential for addressing that? Obviously, the railroads are very concerned about liability, and one of the reasons why we have difficulties in this country in making some investments in high-speed rail is this whole liability problem. In fact, because of the FRA requirements with regard to high-speed trains, we can't run trains at 357 miles an hour like the TG just did in the test run the other day. But have you begun to think about how to address this liability problem in a way that will benefit both freight and rail and passenger rail?
APTA has, in fact, we're going to have a series of meetings starting next month. We're looking at potentially pooling of commuter rails and railroads. Can we create pools which would reduce the cost of the individual parties? That's one. Is there a possibility of creating a certain level that is required of liability insurance by, say, a carrier like VRE, and then at the top there's a cap, and above that cap maybe the federal government take over, similar to the nuclear industry. So we're looking at that, and APTA is taking the lead on that. I think there's benefit there. It could take a lot. Right now, each agency has their own insurance program, and that's a costly approach. And anytime you can create a bigger pool, it should be cheaper for us.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. We have a similar issue in that we indemnify the host railroads completely on any passenger-related issues. So again, I've just begun to scratch the surface on that issue, but I would echo that we could well benefit from a different structure. Now, as to ever running a 300-kilometer-an-hour train on a freight railroad, I don't think that's
mile per hour.
Mile per hour. I don't think that's going to happen. But clearly, I think we can do an awful lot with 80 to 110 mile an hour traffic in a mixed mode.
Thank you,
Mr. Kamant. Obviously, Amtrak reform is again a hot issue here in town and across the country. One of the proposals pending in Congress envisions a significant role for this agency, for the STB. In looking at it, it would call on the STB to actually assign accountability or blame and actually assess penalties to the whoever's causing an Amtrak train to be late. How do you see that if that were to become the law of the land? Do you see that as helpful and workable? And what do we need to do as an agency to be thinking about getting ready for such a role? Because to me, it sounds a little challenging to drop down in the middle of wherever in the country and figure out what happened at 2 a.m. the week before when the train was late.
I confess I'm lukewarm about it, particularly because I think the thresholds are pretty low. I think it has something like 2 months of a certain performance threshold. And again, I think that if we generate funding mechanisms to really work on capacity problems jointly and keep driving the relationship between Amtrak and the host railroads, those are the best solutions. Now the question still is, every setup needs urgency at some point. So I guess I would just be of a mind to soften the threshold a little bit, because I think you'll be spending all your time on Amtrak hearings if the threshold is as it's set today. And again, particularly punitive solutions, I don't think it's usually, as they say, sunlight's the best disinfectant. So I think to have structures where at least the issues are laid out and reported and made very public, not to try to embarrass anybody, but simply to deal with the issues, I think is of greater importance than attaching particularly punitive types of reactions to some of these things.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yes, Mr. Zaner.
I have found in my career and even in other fields, when you start trying to charge penalties, you get into the administration, I call the administration of the penalty. People say, well, you owe us money, or I want to withhold money. And then there's the big hearing, well, it wasn't all my fault, there was these other circumstances. Generally speaking, on a railroad, when a train starts to go late, it's multiple. It's cascades. You might start with a mechanical issue, then it becomes a switch issue, then it becomes a dispatcher has to make a choice. He's got a train out of slot, now what do I do? And he may have a high priority Amtrak, he may have a high, and so he has to make a decision, and may even cause it to go later. But, those are decisions people have to make. So it starts to cascade rapidly, and when you do the after-action report, so to speak, you can say there's 5 reasons for that delay, of which maybe some is the railroad, some could be the equipment, and the responsibility of, in a sense, the commuter rail. And then you get into issues like passenger loading, and you got 3 or 4 handicaps. Now you took 5 minutes to the station to unload these handicapped people. So it just cascades, and it gets really, really hard. I personally like incentives, where if you do better than what we think you should be doing, then we'll give you more money, or give you more capital, or give you more something. So you're working towards something as opposed to trying to defend your position.
Thank you. We have a lot of practitioners here in the room, obviously, who have various matters pending before us, and they're familiar with our docket. And right now, we don't have a lot of room in our docket for hundreds of investigations and cases about who to fine for a train that was 2 hours and 5 minutes late. And it is a worry that the proposals don't come with any staff or resources for us. We're happy to try to play a role in improving, very happy to try to play a role in improving passenger rail service, but just a little worried about some of the details. And I hope we can work with your two organizations to see what we can do to get to a better outcome. Lastly, for Mr. Zaner, longstanding interest of mine is what I'll call premium service or express trains. I grew up with them in New Jersey Transit. I have express trains. I know the New York metropolitan area is a pretty established and sophisticated passenger rail market, but do you see that as an opportunity that may grow around the country and then closer to home? Is VRE looking at any possibilities of any express train type premium service? And I think a lot of passengers would be happy to pay more for that.
I agree. The market for commuter rail, the real market is the further out is the real market. In our case, Fredericksburg and Manassas have the people that are the more habitual users, the ones that really need it. They have the longest car commute. That's really the reason why. An idea came from our staff, and I've talked to CSX about running a Fredericksburg line train, maybe make Fredericksburg, Leland, Brook, and then just run all the way in. Make it the first train in the morning, and then follow with a normal local train afterwards. It's picked up in the press. People have talked about it, but I think we have to finish a few more projects before we could entertain that. And we could then add a train, contractually add a train. I think that's a possibility. The other is Amtrak. In many ways, we have a cross-honoring with Amtrak, where people can get on at Fredericksburg, Quantico, and Woodbridge, and that, in a sense, acts as an express train also. And we're going through some issues now, talking about raising that fee, charging the customer more for that service, which is 20 minutes quicker, and it's an Amtrak coach, which is a much nicer coach than a commuter rail coach. So I think there's a market there, especially on the longer distances.
Thank you. I'll say that Amtrak service is greatly appreciated, as I've mentioned to Mr. Camont, and as is the stop here at the L'Enfant Plaza neighborhood. As a L'Enfant Plaza resident, we can say that. Thank you for stopping those trains there occasionally. I think that completes questions. If I see my
No more, thank you.
thank you so much for being with us today. Look forward to working with you. And at this point, we'll take a quick 15-minute break and regroup for the next panel, which will be state government representatives from AASHTO, Texas, Virginia Port Authority, and Washington State. Thank you. We are temporarily adjourned.